Superman is the most important superhero in history, and he had a bunch of really successful movies. But DC messed up the live-action franchise 3 different times, wasting some amazing actors that fans really loved, canceling projects, disrespecting directors, and leaving everyone wanting more. Still, Superman is such a massive icon that he managed to get past all those setbacks and made it back to the top thanks to the new movie. Today, we're going to take a look at Superman's rise, fall, and his big comeback on the big screen. It all started back in 1974, when producers Alexander and Ilya Salkind got the movie rights to make a live-action Superman movie. They wanted to create the most ambitious blockbuster ever, which sounded totally crazy at the time. Back then, superheroes were only showing up in low-budget TV shows, and no one besides comic book readers really took them seriously. But these guys wanted to shoot 2 Superman movies back-to-back, with big-name actors and staying true to the source material. It took them a few years to get Richard Donner on board to direct both movies, and Tom Mankiewicz to write the scripts. Without these guys, Superman's history in cinemas would have gone in a very different direction. The Salkinds wanted the Man of Steel to be played by a big-time actor like Sylvester Stallone, but Donner insisted on going with someone unknown. That's how they picked Christopher Reeve, a guy who looked exactly like Superman but only had experience on stage. It was a huge gamble, but the movie turned out so well that Reeve became the most beloved Superman of all time, and a big inspiration for every actor who came after him.
They love me.
At first, the Salkinds had a tough time convincing studios that these 2 movies would be a hit, but they managed to get a $55 million budget for the first film. That might not sound like much money now, but back then, it was the most expensive movie in cinema history. A big chunk of that money went into visual effects, which totally changed the industry thanks to platforms, blue screens, and miniatures. Again, it might not seem like a big deal now, but keep in mind this movie is 47 years old. This was the best they could do at the time. Donner was really serious about making the effects believable, since he didn't want the movie to be a joke. He added a few funny moments with Lex Luthor's goons, and gave the movie a bit of a campy vibe that you hardly see these days. But the movie focused on what it would be like to see a man with amazing powers choosing to do good just because it's the right thing to do. Reeve's Superman was gentle and kind, but not dumb. He was noble, and just seeing him made you want to be a better person. People fell in love with the character, the actor, and Richard Donner's vision, and it showed at the box office. The movie made $300 million worldwide, making it the 3rd highest grossing film ever at the time, just behind Star Wars and Jaws. Adjusted for inflation, that would be around $1.5 billion today. Calling it a hit would be putting it mildly. Superman was a symbol of hope. Reeve got super famous, and the Salkinds were celebrating because their big gamble had paid off. This could have been the most important franchise in movie history, but then the problems started.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Superman 2 was already confirmed, but Donner had a bunch of arguments with the Salkinds over the budget, creative control, and especially the involvement of producer Pierre Spengler, who he didn't get along with. According to Ilya Salkind, Donner said he'd only do Superman 2 on his own terms, and without taking orders from Spengler, so they fired the director halfway through production and never reached out to him again. Since they had to keep going with the movie no matter what, they brought in his friend Richard Lester, who had worked on Superman 1. But Lester had a totally different vision. He finished shooting the movie and changed a ton of stuff, mostly the tone. Donner wanted Superman 2 to be even more serious than the first one. That's why he included a whole subplot where Clark had to choose between living a normal life with the woman he loved or staying a stoic superhero. But Lester added jokes, gags, and visual humor to lighten the tone. That ended up turning Superman 2 into a sort of Frankenstein movie that sometimes felt serious and other times tried to be a comedy. What's actually funny is that something similar happened more than 30 years later.
And it will happen again.
But even though Superman 2 had a messy production, hardly anyone knew about it. In 1980, there was no social media, and the film industry wasn't as mainstream as it is today, so no one launched any campaigns to bring Donner back. Most fans didn't even know he'd been fired. People had no idea they were watching a twisted version of the original film, but they could tell Superman 2 just wasn't as good as the first one. It had some solid moments, and no one walked out of the theater hating it, but it definitely wasn't a generational event like Superman 1. It made $216 million, which would be around $840 million in today's money. Not bad numbers at all, but way off from the $1.5 billion the original pulled in. It made sense, since people just didn't like it as much as the first one. Still, the film turned a profit, and making a 3rd movie to keep milking the franchise seemed like a no-brainer. Before he got fired, Donner had plans for at least 2 more Superman movies, with Brainiac and Mr. Mxyzptlk as the villains. Supergirl was also going to show up, but her story was a bit weird. She was supposed to be raised by Brainiac, who'd fall in love with her, but she'd reject him because she was in love with Superman. Apparently, the 2 of them were going to get married at the end of the saga, which would have been super controversial, since in the comics they're cousins.
That's gross.
But since Donner and Mankiewicz were no longer involved with the franchise after Superman 2, the Salkinds and Spengler scrapped all those plans and did something even more controversial. Turns out, comedian Richard Pryor, who was pretty famous at the time, had mentioned he wanted to be in a Superman movie. So they hired him and gave him a role that was basically co-lead. Lester came back as director, but this time he went all in on making a comedy to let Pryor shine. Instead of bringing in Brainiac or using other Superman villains like Metallo or Parasite, they threw in a corrupt businessman with a supercomputer that could run itself. They even added a subplot where Superman turns evil and ends up fighting weak Clark Kent for control of his body. Lex Luthor didn't even show up. And Margot Kidder's scenes as Lois Lane were cut way down because the actress wasn't happy at all about Donner being fired. If all of that sounds bad, the reception was even worse. Superman 3 only made $80 million worldwide, less than half of what the previous movie pulled in. Fans were disappointed, casual audiences didn't even know what they were watching, and the critics tore it apart. Even Reeve later admitted that the whole concept of the movie was wrong, and that the producers had hired 2 new writers just to make a Richard Pryor comedy instead of telling a Superman story. The Man of Steel went from being a symbol of hope to being the punchline of a bad joke, and he wasn't even the main character in his own movie.
Unacceptable.
The Superman brand was seriously damaged, and the franchise was about to die, but Reeve tried to save it. Knowing there was no way they could replace him because fans loved him, Reeve agreed to do a 4th movie, but only if he could have direct influence on the script and the storyline. He wanted to make up for Superman 3, so he came up with the idea of having Superman get involved in political conflicts. Seeing that the world's most powerful countries had no intention of getting rid of their nukes, Superman gathered all the bombs and threw them into the sun to make the world a better place. It was a bold idea, but it could have worked. It actually sounded like something Superman would do, but everything else was a total mess. After Superman 3 and the Supergirl movie flopped, the Salkinds left the franchise. They handed the film rights over to Cannon Films, a studio known for making super low-budget action flicks. Say what you want about the Salkinds, but just like John Hammond, they spared no expense, not even on Superman 3, which cost $39 million. But Superman 4 only cost $17 million, which was very low even for the 80s. They barely had enough money to pay Christopher Reeve's salary, and Gene Hackman's too, since he came back to play Lex Luthor. But it was obvious they didn't have a dime left for sets or effects.
I'm broke.
In every action scene, you could literally see the wires holding up the actors. The effects were awful, and they filmed in empty-looking locations. Reeve admitted that even if the story had been amazing, people still wouldn't have left the theater happy, because the budget just wasn't enough to make a proper blockbuster. It didn't help that the main villain was Nuclear Man, a brand new character made up just for the movie. He was a clone of Superman who made Clark sick with his radioactive powers, which was as bad as it sounds. To make things worse, Cannon Films cut the movie's runtime in half, deleting some fights and entire subplots. The final cut was a low-budget disaster that didn't even work as ironic fun. This movie is painful to watch, and as anyone could have guessed, except for the studio, it bombed hard at the box office. It only made $36 million worldwide and became the biggest flop in Superman's history. The reception was so bad, the studio had to drop all their plans for Superman 5. Cannon Films luckily went bankrupt, but by then, the damage was already done. Reeve later admitted he never should have agreed to do this movie, because Superman 4 killed the franchise and ruined what the character meant for a lot of people. A saga that could have been one of the most successful of all time ended up as a joke, a parody, and a textbook example of what not to do with a character like this.
It's a mess.
Superman had never fallen this low, but then Warner showed up. After a long and boring rights battle, Warner Brothers finally got the movie rights to Superman and tried to make a new film many times. They were convinced the character could be a hit again like back in 1978, and they wanted to throw a ton of money at it, just like the Salkinds had done. But none of the ideas really landed, mostly because they were all kind of ridiculous. The first crazy pitch was Superman Reborn, which was supposed to loosely adapt the death of Superman. That comic had been a huge hit back in 1992, so Gregory Poirier, who wrote National Treasure 2, thought it'd be awesome if Superman died fighting Doomsday. But instead of adapting the reign of the Supermen, he came up with the idea that Superman's life force would merge with Lois Lane, and she'd end up pregnant. She was literally gonna give birth to a new Superman, who'd grow into an adult in just a few days.
That's the worst idea I've ever heard.
Thankfully, some Warner exec realized this was the worst idea in human history, so they shut the whole thing down before production even started. But they didn't give up on the idea of adapting the death of Superman. The second infamous project was Superman Lives, written by Kevin Smith and directed by Tim Burton, who had just reinvented Batman in the '89 movie. Once again, Superman was going to die at the hands of Doomsday, but then he'd come back to fight Brainiac, who would fuse with Lex Luthor to become a new entity called Lexiac. And that's not even the weirdest part. For some reason, Superman was gonna fight a giant spider, just because producer John Peters wanted it. Peters also demanded that Superman shouldn't wear his classic suit and couldn't fly. And as if all that wasn't bad enough, Christopher Reeve had a near-fatal accident in 1995 that left him quadriplegic, so Warner had to find a new actor to play Superman. They picked Nicolas Cage, who had long hair like in The Return of Superman, and they blew over $30 million on production. But they realized this movie was just impossible to make. The action scenes were going to be insanely expensive, and the studio couldn't afford another flop after Steel and Batman and Robin. Worried that the gothic vibe didn't suit Superman and that people would hate this new version, they scrapped the whole thing in 1998. The good news is that Nicolas Cage finally got to live his dream of playing Superman many years later in The Flash, even though they covered his face with CGI for reasons nobody really understands.
You are horrifying to look at.
This is where things got pretty messy. There were some changes in Warner's leadership, and two groups formed with very different visions. Some wanted to reboot the franchise from scratch, telling Superman's origin all over again. But others wanted to take advantage of owning the rights to all the DC characters, and kick off the first cinematic universe ever, with epic crossovers between Superman, Batman, and the rest of the Justice League. So Warner started developing two very different projects at the same time in the early 2000s. Batman vs. Superman and Superman Flyby. The first one was going to be a crossover directed by Wolfgang Peterson from Troy and the Perfect Storm, and written by Andrew Kevin Walker from Seven, and Akiva Goldsman, the same guy from the infamous Batman and Robin. The idea was to make a dark, gothic, and depressing movie. The story would start with Superman divorced from Lois Lane, and Bruce Wayne retired and grieving the loss of all his loved ones. They'd start out as friends, but Lex would manipulate them into fighting each other. Batman would win the fight in the third act, but he'd spare Superman's life, just like in The Dark Knight Returns. The movie would also show Lex wearing his comic book armor, a Joker clone, and a meteor shower threatening to destroy Earth. Honestly, it sounded a lot more promising than the previous two canceled movies. Warner was so confident in this project that they planned to start filming in 2003 and release it in 2004. But at the last minute, Alan Horn, Warner's CEO at the time, pulled the plug, saying the story was just too dark. He thought it would be better to introduce the characters separately and save the crossover for later. Without realizing it, they were about to beat Marvel to the punch by a few years, before Phase 1 of the MCU even launched.
Because I'm from the future.
The only thing we ever saw from this movie was a fake poster in I Am Legend, which was also produced by Warner, and parts of the script later inspired Batman v Superman by Zack Snyder in 2016. But we'll get to that. For now, let's talk about Superman Flyby. This was the second project Warner was working on in the 2000s. It was going to be an origin story written by J.J. Abrams, with a few twists to Superman's usual backstory. The movie was going to kick off with a civil war on Krypton between Jor-El and his evil brother. Before being sentenced to prison, Jor-El would send his son to Earth, and unlike the comics, Krypton wasn't going to be destroyed. Instead, Clark would grow up on Earth and then return to Krypton to save his people. There were still some classic elements, like Clark's childhood in Smallville and his romance with Lana Lang. But in the middle of all that, Lex was going to be a CIA agent, and Superman would have to face his uncle's Kryptonian army. There were even some pretty dumb scenes too, like Superman dying in the third act, and his dad sacrificing himself to go to Kryptonian heaven and convince Clark to come back to life.
That's the stupidest idea you've ever had.
Weird stuff aside, Warner was really into this project. They even got to the audition stage, with Henry Cavill lined up to play Superman and Robert Downey Jr. as Lex Luthor. This was going to be Robert's big comeback, since Iron Man 1 wasn't even on Marvel's radar yet. But this movie had a bunch of problems. J.J. Abrams wanted to make it a full trilogy, which ended up getting crammed into just one movie, so the story would have been totally overloaded. On top of that, he wanted to include full-on Kryptonian war scenes, which would have needed a huge VFX budget. It would have been one of the most expensive movies ever made, which, to be fair, wouldn't have been new for Superman. But Warner execs weren't too sure about spending that kind of cash on a movie that strayed so far from what people knew about the character from the comics, cartoons, and the Christopher Reeve films. This new Superman was looking more like a space Moses than a classic superhero. Plus, there were directors coming and going, and a bunch of problems with casting the supporting characters. Just when the corpse of Superman Flyby was getting cold, a new proposal caught Warner's attention: Superman Returns. In 2004, Bryan Singer, who had just directed two very successful X-Men movies, left Fox to make a Superman film, since he was a big fan of the character. Instead of reinventing the Man of Steel, like everyone had been trying to do for the past decade, Singer wanted to take it back to basics. He wasn't planning to adapt the death of Superman, didn't want to cross him over with Batman, and had no interest in adding any religious symbolism. The director's idea was to bring back the tone of the original Reeve movies by making a spiritual sequel to Superman 2 that was nostalgic, emotional, inspiring, and just a little campy. Warner liked the idea, so they threw out Abrams' scripts and got on board with Singer. Of course, they had bigger plans than just telling another Superman story. Some execs were hoping to eventually link this new Superman to Nolan's Batman, which had launched the year before with Batman Begins, though that never actually happened.
That's a shame.
To really lean into nostalgia, Singer brought back the classic John Williams theme, included the Fortress of Solitude, and used archive audio of Marlon Brando as Jor-El. He even copied Donner's casting style and picked an unknown, Brandon Routh, to play Superman. His version of Lex Luthor also took cues from Gene Hackman's: sexy girlfriends, dumb henchmen, and a touch of comedy. The story was looking pretty solid. The movie started 5 years after Superman mysteriously vanished. When he came back to Earth, he found out the world had moved on without him. Lois had a kid and had won a Pulitzer for writing an article roasting Superman. Lex Luthor, meanwhile, had a new evil plan, using Kryptonian crystals to create his own country, kinda like a follow-up to his plan in Superman 1. Of course, Singer couldn't resist adding some of his own weird touches. He turned Superman into a stalker and cast James Marsden to play the guy getting cheated on for the second time. Still, Superman Returns felt like part of Richard Donner's continuity. It honored the original, had a sweet message, an inspiring tone, and pretty good effects for 2006. But it just wasn't enough. Some fans loved this return to the roots, since Superman finally felt like Superman again, and not just some running joke. But a lot of casual viewers thought the film was slow, boring, and lacking in action for a superhero flick. Compared to X-Men, Spider-Man, or Batman Begins, Superman Returns came up short. The Man of Steel didn't even show up in action until about 30 minutes in. The continuity was confusing, and a lot of the best scenes felt like they were copied from Superman 1. Sadly, it just didn't keep up with the early 2000s superhero movie boom. This lukewarm reception showed at the box office. Superman Returns made $391 million, becoming the highest-grossing Superman movie ever, without adjusting for inflation. It wasn't far off from X-Men 2 or Batman Begins, but Warner had spent $270 million just on production. It was one of the most expensive movies ever made. To be considered a true success, it needed to make around $600 million, since theaters take a cut of ticket sales, and that's not even counting marketing costs. So sadly, it flopped. Maybe not as hard as Superman 3 or The Quest for Peace, but The Man of Steel had failed once again at the movies. And this had serious consequences for Superman. Since the movie lost money, Warner canceled the plans for a sequel, which was supposedly going to be called Man of Steel, and feature Brainiac as the villain. That also meant we never got to see Ruth's Superman cross paths with Christian Bale's Batman. But here's the funny part. Just a year earlier, Warner had released Batman Begins, which only made $375 million, even less than Superman Returns. But because Nolan's Batman got such great reviews, they decided to keep going with that story, and ended up with one of the best trilogies of all time. I know Superman Returns had a bigger budget than Batman Begins, and its reviews weren't as glowing, but if Warner's execs had just been a bit more patient, they might have been able to keep the Routh version going. Instead, he had to wait 14 years to suit up again. But scrapping this new saga wasn't the biggest problem. The real issue was that Warner drew the wrong conclusions from the failure. People were saying they got bored in the theater because there wasn't enough action. But Warner thought the problem was that Superman just didn't sell anymore. They figured his values, and even his costume, felt outdated and didn't click with audiences in the mid-2000s. They thought people wanted darker heroes like Batman or Singer's X-Men. This idea only grew stronger with the rise of evil Supermen in comics like Invincible and The Boys, which were already popular even before they had shows on Prime Video. It seemed like if Warner wanted Superman to succeed in live action again, they had to ditch the classic image and go for something more modern. Basically, turn him into Batman.
I'm Batman.
But that was about as fake as your girlfriend saying the guy you're worried about is just a friend. Superman had already had classic-style adaptations that were hits on TV, like the 90s animated series, or his appearances in Justice League Unlimited. A live-action version with that same tone and character, but with more action than Superman Returns, would have probably been a hit. But after the Nolan trilogy pulled in $2.5 billion, it was impossible to convince Warner's execs that a superhero who wasn't Batman could also crush it at the box office. That's how we ended up with Man of Steel. In 2010, Warner got Christopher Nolan to sign on as producer for a new Superman movie that would reboot the whole franchise. Nolan's job was to put up the money and make sure the story was solid, just like with his Batman saga. They also brought in his writing partner, David Goyer, a super hit-or-miss screenwriter who, on a good day, gives you The Dark Knight. But when he's not feeling it, you get Blade Trinity or Ghost Rider 2. To make sure the movie had quality visuals and action, Warner hired Zack Snyder as director. At the time, they had a great relationship with him, since he had just done Watchmen and 300, both well-received well-received comic book adaptations. Snyder seemed like the perfect choice to make an epic, action-packed movie about a conflicted, alienated Superman trying to find his place in the world. They even added biblical themes, just like Abrams had wanted to do in Superman Flyby. And that wasn't the only connection to that canceled movie. To play Superman, they picked Henry Cavill, who had almost landed the role in Superman Flyby. During auditions led by Zack and Deborah Snyder, they had Cavill try on Christopher Reeve's classic suit. They fell in love with him instantly because nobody else looked that good in the costume.
A handsome, muscular man.
Cavill went through a full-on body transformation to get absolutely huge, becoming the most physically imposing Superman ever. He even wore a muscle suit to look extra ripped, making him stand apart from Brandon Routh and Christopher Reeve, who had a slimmer build. And that was just one of many things that set this new Superman apart from the ones before. Man of Steel was the complete opposite of Superman Returns in every possible way. The fights were epic. The special effects still hold up today. Superman faced off against a villain with powers just like his. Lex Luthor wasn't reused, and the overall tone was totally different. Cavill's Superman didn't save kittens or wink at the camera. He was a much more serious version of the character. He was grounded, morally complex, and far from the classic Boy Scout vibe. Luckily, it didn't have the weird stuff from the canceled movies, but Snyder and Nolan did try to reinvent the character for a modern audience. Even the suit was different. They ditched the red underwear and the bright blue colors, and the result turned out pretty solid. Critics tore it apart, but a big chunk of the audience welcomed this new Superman. Everyone was talking about the character again, since people couldn't agree on whether this was the best live-action Superman or if it completely betrayed the core values of the character. The biggest achievement of Man of Steel was creating a whole new generation of Superman fans, just like Nolan's Batman or Raimi's Spider-Man had done. For the first time since 1980, Superman was trending, and his live-action return was a box office success. Man of Steel pulled in $670 million and became the highest-grossing Superman movie ever. It was nowhere near The Dark Knight's numbers, but it still managed to make a profit, something Superman Returns didn't pull off. And sure, not everyone was into Cavill's darker Superman, and a lot of people weren't happy about him killing Zod in such a brutal way. But even with those controversies, everyone was hyped for Man of Steel 2, whether it was going to be directed by Zack Snyder or someone else. Superman was finally back on top at the movies after 33 years, and everything seemed to be going well. But Man of Steel 2 never happened.
Why not?
Turns out, neither Snyder nor Warner ever planned to make a direct sequel starring Superman, and it had nothing to do with Man of Steel's box office performance. Snyder had a super ambitious plan to build out a whole Justice League saga that would end with a massive battle against Darkseid. Along the way, Superman was going to die, come back to life, turn evil because of the anti-life equation, and get cheated on by Lois with Batman. But in that whole arc, there was no room for a solo Superman story. Not until the very end of the saga, which meant we were looking at a wait of over 10 years to see Man of Steel 2, if it ever even happened. But at least Superman was still supposed to be a key character. On the other hand, Warner's execs were obsessed with launching a cinematic universe as fast as possible to compete with the MCU, which was already killing it and had introduced the Avengers. The middle ground they landed on was going ahead with some of Snyder's ideas, but adding spin-offs for Wonder Woman and Aquaman to give the vibe that this was a shared universe. They also brought back some ideas from the scrapped Batman vs. Superman movie from the 2000s, this time with Snyder directing. That's how we got the always controversial Batman v Superman. This movie picked up where Man of Steel left off, and even addressed the whole Metropolis destruction backlash that fans had pointed out. But it was hard to see it as a Superman movie, since Clark had fewer lines than Batman and even whoever Eisenberg was playing. To make things worse, this was an even darker version of Superman that scared off some of the casual audience, especially when he said stuff like this.
The bat is dead. Bury it.
No one stays good in this world.
I don't believe what I'm hearing.
The movie ended with Superman's death at the hands of Doomsday, something Warner had been trying to adapt since the 90s. And the box office numbers were strong, about $870 million. It still didn't beat Nolan's Batman, but it was the highest grossing movie with Superman's name on it, at least not counting inflation. But as we covered in earlier videos, which I'm sure you've already seen since you're subscribed, this movie split the fandom. It also made Warner start doubting if Snyder's vision was the right one to keep following, because people weren't fully on board with this new universe. Also, Superman's death didn't land the way Warner had hoped. That kind of storyline might have worked back in the 90s or early 2000s. But in 2016, fans wanted DC to finally build a solid cinematic universe, like Marvel had done. Killing Superman in just his second appearance felt wrong, even if they promised he'd come back in Justice League. And remember, at that time, we didn't know what Snyder's long-term plan looked like, so this scene left people feeling uncertain. The good news was that Superman was still super popular, but the bad news was they had killed him off. Since he was buried, Cavill's Superman couldn't even make cameos in Suicide Squad or Wonder Woman. We didn't see him again until November 2017 in Whedon's Justice League. Between the backlash from Batman v Superman and Snyder having to step away from Justice League after his daughter's passing, Warner took the opportunity to change course. They scrapped all of Snyder's plans and brought in Joss Whedon to shift the tone of Justice League. But nobody was happy with the result, not even Snyder's critics, because the movie was a weird Frankenstein mess. The only somewhat decent part was Superman's brief return, where he wore a brighter suit and had a much friendlier attitude compared to his earlier appearances. He felt closer to the classic comic book Superman and the Christopher Reeve version, which actually worked well for some fans and casual viewers. But sadly, it was a good Superman trapped in a bad movie that ended up as a joke. From this point on, Superman's live-action journey took a nosedive. If Warner didn't want to move forward with Snyder's story, the least they could have done was build around this Superman, especially since fans had finally embraced him. Even people who hated Batman v Superman liked Cavill and wanted to see him keep playing the role. Cavill himself said in interviews that he was dying to do Man of Steel 2, but that never happened.
Why not?
Warner didn't really know what direction to take after the Justice League fiasco, but one thing was clear. They wanted to get as far away from the Snyderverse as possible. Walter Hamada, who became president of DC in 2018, came up with the brilliant idea of adapting Flashpoint as a soft reboot to quietly get rid of half the original cast. Since Cavill's Superman was set to be replaced by Sasha Calle's Supergirl, the character was put on ice, and we didn't see him on screen for 5 whole years. The closest we got was a headless cameo at the end of Shazam in 2019, which gave fans some hope that Superman still existed in the DC universe. But we had no idea if Cavill was still playing him. It wasn't until 2021 that we finally saw Superman again, in the Snyder Cut. Desperate to compete in the streaming wars, Warner swallowed their pride and called up Snyder to finish his version of Justice League, which turned out to be a hit on HBO Max. This Superman wasn't as warm and cheerful as in the Whedon version, because Snyder was setting up the groundwork for the dark side-controlled evil Superman. The good news for fans was that this cut included some flight scenes that were missing from the theatrical version. Plus, they digitally tweaked the suit to make it black, just like in the Return of Superman arc in the comics.
Make this look good.
Some fans hoped this meant we'd get a Snyder Cut sequel with Cavill, but Warner made it crystal clear they had zero interest in continuing that universe, and that the Whedon version, where Darkseid didn't exist, was the official canon. So we had to settle for Superman being mentioned in the Suicide Squad, and showing up in silhouette during the last episode of Peacemaker. Superman wasn't a joke like in the 90s, but this was still his lowest point since Superman Returns flopped. He went from being the star of the DCU to a faceless cameo. He wasn't trending, no one knew who would play him, and there was no news about future appearances. Warner was even thinking about replacing him with his cousin, as if the Man of Steel just didn't sell anymore. But everything changed in 2022. After the Warner Discovery merger, Hamada was fired, and David Zaslav became the new CEO of the company. He was convinced that DC characters could make more money than Marvel's, and he wanted to get a Superman movie off the ground as soon as possible. There were some serious talks about Man of Steel 2 with Cavill, but Dwayne Johnson, who had been cast as Black Adam, managed to convince Zaslav to do a Superman vs. Black Adam crossover instead. They made up with Cavill, who was dying to come back, and rushed to shoot a post-credit scene teasing the crossover.
We should talk.
Yes! 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 Yes!
Of course, a Superman vs. Black Adam showdown wasn't exactly the crossover fans were dreaming of, since Black Adam is Shazam's nemesis, not Superman's. But people were so desperate for Superman news that the post-credit scene broke the internet, and everyone was talking about Cavill's social media posts confirming his return. There were no dates locked in for Black Adam vs. Superman, but it felt like just a matter of time before they found a director. And after that, we'd probably finally get Man of Steel 2. It would have arrived more than 10 years after the first one, but hey, better late than never. But sadly, the hype didn't last long. Even with Dwayne Johnson's popularity and the buzz around Cavill's return, Black Adam bombed at the box office. Zaslav and his team quickly realized The Rock had played them. He only wanted to fight Superman on the big screen to take over DC, just like he tried to do with the Fast and Furious franchise. They kicked him out before things got messier, and also scrapped all plans for Black Adam vs. Superman. Still, since Zaslav was set on keeping DC going, he founded DC Studios, a new separate studio run by James Gunn and Peter Safran. These two wanted to make a solo Superman movie, but in a brand new universe and without Henry Cavill. In December 2022, Cavill announced he wouldn't be returning as Superman because the new DC universe was going in a different direction. No one really explained why they dropped him, but the most likely reason was that Gunn wanted a near-total reboot to set his universe apart. Even with a soft reboot, if they kept Cavill, people would naturally compare the Gunnverse to the Snyderverse. Or worse, some people might think it was just a continuation of the old DCU. As you might expect, this decision stirred up a lot of controversy. James Gunn got slammed by all the Cavill fans and the Snyderverse supporters. Some people were already hoping the new Superman would flop before the movie was even announced. But despite all the noise and uncertainty, Zaslav trusted Gunn, who pitched him a 10-year plan for the DC universe. They gave him $225 million to make a Superman movie that would be totally different from everything before. Gunn didn't try to copy Richard Donner's formula, but he also didn't try to completely reinvent the character. His Superman would be kind and try to save everyone like Christopher Reeve's version, but at the same time, he'd have real-life worries and relationship problems. He brought back the red trunks and the yellow S on the cape, but also added a bunch of weird lines like the new 52 suit. He wasn't telling an origin story or doing a crossover with Batman, but he did throw in other superheroes to give a shared universe vibe. Plus, Gunn drew inspiration from the wild comic book ideas of the 60s, just without going completely off the rails like the previously scrapped movies. And he picked David Corenswet as his Superman, an almost unknown, just like they did in 1978 and 2006.
It's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
There was drama about the suit design, the look of the first photo, and the recasting. But the more we saw from the movie, the more the hype kept growing. The cast was awesome, the marketing campaign was huge, and it really seemed like this was going to be the Superman for a whole new generation. The Man of Steel started trending again, because the first teaser got over 250 million views in its first 24 hours, almost reaching the numbers of the biggest Marvel movies. And the new Superman delivered. The critics liked it, the fans loved it, and even casual viewers accepted the new Superman. Corenswet crushed it as both Clark Kent and the Man of Steel. Rachel Brosnahan became the best Lois Lane in movie history, and Nicholas Hoult gave us one of the best Lex Luthors ever. It's still too early to say if this Superman will have the same impact as Christopher Reeve's. What we do know is that the movie made $125 million in its opening weekend, the best numbers in the character's entire history. It's a strong start for this universe, and it brought Superman back to the top. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably a bit confused about how the new canon works in this new DCU. I break it all down in this video.
I'm so confused.